مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. سلطت الضربة الصاروخية التي استهدفت منطقة بولندية قرب الحدود مع أوكرانيا الضوء على خطر تصعيد الحرب الدائرة منذ فبراير الماضي. للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا شاشانك جوشي، زميل زائر في قسم دراسات الحرب في كينجز كوليدج في لندن. سيد شاشانك، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you for having me.
هل فتحت الضربة الصاروخية على بولندا الباب أمام أكبر مخاوف الحرب في أوكرانيا، وهو أن يتحول الصراع إلى مواجهة أوسع بين موسكو وحلف الناتو التي تقوده الولايات المتحدة؟
Well, it reminds us of the dangers of escalation. It's not the first accident that we have seen. We, for example, last month saw that a Russian fighter jet accidentally fired an air-to-air missile when it was flying very close to a British surveillance plane. And back in the spring, back in March, I believe it was, we also saw a drone carrying explosives crash in the country of Croatia, which is quite far from Ukraine. So the risk of these accidents is always present. But I think the much bigger risk at this stage is not so much an accident and an accidental escalation. I think the real concern where I am here in the UK and in Europe is the fear of a deliberate escalation by Russia. If it fears that its military position is weakening, that its country is at some risk, that the regime is at some threat, the fear that it may use nuclear weapons if Ukraine advances on the battlefield too quickly or too far. So I think accidents are a concern, but deliberate escalation is a much more serious concern at this time.
نعم، لكن لو ضرب صاروخ روسي غير متعمد أراضي الناتو، هل سيضطر الحلف إلى اتخاذ قرار؟
No. NATO, of course, has something called Article 5, which is the mutual defense clause. It says that an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. But it's important to remember a few things. One of them is that an accident is not the same as an attack. So we must remember that. Legally, politically, symbolically, an accidental strike is not the same as an intentional strike. And I think that NATO leaders would bear that in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is that even if there is a deliberate attack at a low level, for example, an act of sabotage against a NATO arms factory in Poland, that in itself would not necessarily meet the threshold of Article 5. And if it did, Article 5 does not obligate all countries to automatically respond with military force. It obligates them only to take whatever steps they think necessary to assist the country that has come under attack. But that does not necessarily mean any kind of retaliation against Russia.
لكن هذا يدفعني إلى سؤالك، في زمن الحرب هل من السهل التفريق بين الضربة المتعمدة والهجوم الخاطئ؟
I think that's a very good question. And the answer is that it's not always easy to differentiate. But I think what we learned from the incident in Poland, was that NATO countries will be very cautious. They will be very careful. They refused to attribute the attack to Russia until they had all the evidence. And that was good, because it turned out that it was not a Russian missile. It was a Ukrainian air defense missile, which now I agree, the responsibility may lie with Russia, because the Ukrainians would not have had to fire this interceptor missile if they had not been under attack. But nonetheless, it shows you that as difficult as it can be to distinguish these things in the heat of war, it is possible, and that countries will be patient and careful in looking through the evidence before they go to their public and point the finger, which I think is a very encouraging sign.
ديمتري بيسكوف المتحدث باسم الرئيس الروسي قال للصحفيين إن الادعاءات الأولية بالمسؤولية الروسية من كييف وبعض الحلفاء الغربيين كانت رد فعل هستيري للروسوفوبيا. ما تعليقك؟ هل تصدقه القول؟
I don't think it's to do with Russophobia or of course, yes, in Europe there is considerable skepticism of the Kremlin's intentions, and there is doubt and mistrust in what they say, but that's to do with not to do with irrational hatred of Russia. It's to do with distrust of the Kremlin, because in the past for example, with the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, the former Russian spy in England in 2018, or the shooting down of flight MH17 over Ukraine, the Kremlin has denied actions that it very clearly was responsible for. And that has left a legacy of mistrust towards its claims. However, I think, as I said, ultimately what we learn from this incident is that if the evidence does not show Russian culpability, if the evidence does not point to Russia, then actually NATO does not blame Russia. In this case, it blamed Ukraine, and it did so publicly. No NATO government, other than, I think, Latvia, which did so by accident initially, actually blamed Russia. So I think that this is evidence-led. This is, I think, proof that countries are willing to look at the evidence and abide by what the facts say rather than their own prejudices.
الرد الفعل الروسي بالنفي العاجل عن المسؤولية هل يشي بموقف موسكو من هكذا مواجهة وأن روسيا لا تريد التصعيد؟
No, I don't think it reveals that. I think it reveals that the Kremlin habitually, routinely denies responsibility for anything. And I have to say, the Kremlin denied responsibility for the war crimes that were discovered in Bucha, north of Kiev, in the spring. It denies responsibility for targeting civilians, just as it did the same thing that it did in Syria, denying responsibility for targeting hospitals in Idlib province in the same way. And I think actually the Russians don't want a war with NATO, but they are comfortable with raising the temperature. They are comfortable with entering into a more risky situation because they feel it is more likely to cause NATO to back down from supporting Ukraine and from challenging Russia. So I think they don't want a conflict, but I think they like engaging in brinksmanship and they like manipulating risk to their own advantage. Whereas Western countries, I think, are quite afraid of risk. They're quite afraid of escalation, sometimes to their disadvantage.
إلى أي مدى هذا الجزء من بولندا، أقصد الحدود، هي مناطق تفاعل أو منخرطة بشكل أو بآخر مع الحرب لجهة اللاجئين ونقل المعدات العسكرية الغربية لمساعدة أوكرانيا على القتال؟
Well, Poland is heavily involved in supporting Ukraine, and many of the factories and depots that are gathering arms and weapons and ammunition for Ukraine are based in Poland. That's no secret. But they're not based in this particular area where the accident occurred, in Lubin province, in this village, which is a very small village with no history of arms factories or anything like that. And there are not even significant crossing points into Ukraine at this territory. So I don't think that the arms supply is a plausible explanation or factor in this incident.
الحادث الحدودي أعاد الدعوات إلى فرض منطقة حظر طيران فوق غرب أوكرانيا. هل سيستقبل الناتو الطلب هذه المرة بطريقة مختلفة؟
I don't think so. I don't think there is any likelihood of a no-fly zone at this stage. And the reason is simple. It's the same reason that has been the case from the beginning, which is a no-fly zone requires NATO to be willing to destroy Russian air defenses on the ground and to destroy Russian aircraft in the air. And I don't think that NATO countries are prepared to take such a step, not least because Ukraine is doing quite well on the battlefield. And although, yes, there is a risk that its air defense systems run out of ammunition, and there is a risk that the Russian Air Force can present a greater threat again, for now, the problem can be handled by Ukraine. And there's no need or appetite for NATO to take such a substantial risk in directly confronting Russia, not least when there are also significant concerns around escalation, Russian nuclear use, Russian nuclear threats. So I think a no-fly zone is not going to happen anytime soon unless Russia does something exceptionally reckless, such as attacking NATO or using nuclear weapons.
دول عدة في مجموعة العشرين لديها مواقف متباينة فيما يتعلق بالعلاقة مع موسكو بعد الحرب. هل سيدفع ذلك الدول الغربية إلى تعزيز النهج التفاوضي؟
I think that there is, of course, a difference of opinion. And the G7 countries are very critical of Russia, but other big powers, as you say, are much more cautious in criticizing Russia because they have their own interests at stake, such as the purchase of oil in the case of India, cooperation in other issues, and OPEC cooperation in the case of Saudi Arabia, and of course, a number of other issues. But I would say that if you look at the G20 summit, Russia was more isolated than it has ever been, because the summit clearly said that most G20 countries condemn the war. That's a very important statement, and it was allegedly introduced by India, which is, of course, a friend of Russia in many respects, a partner of Russia, and yet they are still willing to engage in this public condemnation of the war at the G20 summit. And even China is willing to sign on to such a summit. I think that's a very interesting signal that they are sending. Now, of course, they're not going to join sanctions on Russia. They're not going to provide arms to Ukraine. They're still going to continue to buy Russian oil. So this is a symbolic condemnation, and it has limits. But I think it shows us that Russia actually does not have all that many friends and partners. And to give you an example of this, China might say some friendly things to Russia, but is it providing ammunition when Russia desperately needs ammunition? No. The Russians are having to look to the North Koreans. And so overall, I would say that Russia is in a fairly a friendless place right now in this conflict.
عند هذه المرحلة هل التطورات ميدانيا وكذلك بعد اتفاق الحبوب أنضجت النهج التفاوضي؟
Well, because I think that ultimately Russia is skeptical of the grain deal. It doesn't really want the grain deal. It doesn't want Ukraine to be able to export its materials because its aim is to try and choke off Ukraine's economy. This is a blockade. This is an economic tool of economic statecraft for Russia. It agreed to the grain deal because it was pressured by countries like Turkey, and it was under international pressure from other countries, including the global south, the countries who import lots of this wheat and grain, and they were seeing disruption to their own food supplies. But Russia does not really embrace the grain deal, and now, because it is losing on the battlefield, it is trying to escalate in other ways, such as through aerial attacks on Ukraine's power grid, and also continued economic warfare against Ukraine. So I am skeptical that the grain deal will be very strong in the months ahead. And I think that the only limiting factor for the Russians is that they are in a pretty weak position in the Black Sea because their ships have come under such threat from Ukrainian missiles. But overall, I am not optimistic about the grain deal's survival.
وعلى هذا الأساس هل من نهاية في الأفق لهذه الحرب؟
I'm sorry to say I don't see it because, yes, the Russians have withdrawn from Kherson in the south. Yes, they have lost 50% of all the territory that they captured at the peak of their offensive in the spring. However, I still think they feel that they are mobilizing hundreds of thousands of new recruits. They feel that they are punishing Ukraine through attacks on its electrical infrastructure, and they feel that Europeans will not have the patience and the stomach for a long, drawn-out conflict in which their own economies may suffer through inflation and high energy prices. So Russia still hopes that even if it cannot win on the battlefield, it can stay in the war longer than Ukraine's partners have the patience to keep it militarily supplied. And therefore, I don't see a coherent path to a solution at this stage. I think that this war is going to last for many, many months longer. I think that Ukraine wants to conduct more offensives in the spring. It will keep fighting through the winter months as well, but I do not see a plausible diplomatic settlement anytime soon.
شاشانك جوشي، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you very much for having me.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.